Let me suppose a scenario. A left-winger and a right-winger are having an argument. They're discussing poverty in black neighborhoods and what the problem is. When the right-winger suggests that it's because of education that many black individuals don't succeed in life, the left-winger gives a confused look. He responds by saying, "So you just think that black people aren't going to school?" The right-winger responds, "Well, it doesn't really have anything to do with what individual black people are doing. It's more..." The left-winger interrupts him, saying, "Do you think black people are just overall worse than white people?" The right-winger responds by saying, "Well, I disagree with the framing of that question. Of course I don't think black people are worse than white people. I'm just saying that often black people are in worse situations than white people." Then the leftist says, "Oh, so now you're saying that black people are more likely to find themselves in bad situations?" The right-winger says yes. Then the leftist responds by calling the right-winger a racist. What would you think? You might say the leftist was overreacting. Perhaps even triggered. Clearly a classic case of a triggered SJW snowflake. Well, what if I told you I had to roll SWAT, and the leftist accusing the right-winger of racism was actually the right-winger and vice versa? Would that change anything for you? Maybe you'd start making excuses, like, "Oh, he was just being ironic," or "the leftist was engaging in bigotry of low expectations," or "Well, the left accuses us of racism all the time, they deserve a taste of their own medicine." Whichever one it is, it doesn't really matter, because it would still apply the other way around. If you've been involved in internet political discourse for a long enough time, you may have heard the term, "the left are the real racist." But what does this actually mean? And most importantly, who are the real racists?
They're the most racist people there are because, they put you in a little category, a little box. You have to think this way. How could you dare come off the plantation?
It's commonly said that racism emanates from the right. I disagree. I think it comes primarily from the left.
So don't believe the leftists about how oppressed we've been.
I think it's pretty apparent that Mr. Luke believes that black people are stupid.
This is the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Tell me again who the racists are?
So let's answer the question. Are the left the real racists? This is actually a very common tactic employed by the right, to say, well, actually, it's the people that are anti-racist that are the real racists. You may have also heard the phrase, "the Democrats are the real racists." Now, I won't be spending much time tackling this particular point for the following reasons. One is because a YouTuber named Polydice, who I really wish would start uploading again, already made 2 heavily researched videos on debunking this idea. And if you want to know more about this topic, I strongly recommend you watch them. He goes over things like the party switch and the Southern strategy, things that I'll be leaving out in this video. Another reason is because this video isn't a defense of the Democrats. Apart from the fact that I still support them over the Republicans, I don't support the Democratic Party. But this doesn't mean that I'm not going to at least try to deconstruct the arguments behind this point. So, an argument that you'll often hear from Republicans, but also from others, is that the Democratic Party used to be the party of slavery and Jim Crow.
Democrats are actually the ones that imposed segregation, and they were the ones majorly against voting to desegregate our communities in both the 1950s and the 1960s. Oh, and those Klansmen that you guys are freaking out about, look under their hoods. They were all Democrats. Yes, Democrats were the ones that were lynching African American people.
And something that always stood out to me about this argument was its reference to what the Democratic Party used to be. And to some of you, this type of argument may sound familiar. And I gotta say, for a group of people that usually fights against the narrative that white people alive today are responsible for the actions of their ancestors, a narrative that I'm also against, this argument sounds a lot like original sin. I mean, it is a right-wing belief after all, but it's a belief that right-wingers reject whenever it's being brought up in a context relating to race. Now, I do understand that there's a difference between people who happen to share the same skin color as slave masters and the Democratic Party. One is an immutable characteristic that people are born with, and the other is a political party that people choose to align with. The first is obviously way worse than the second. But that doesn't make it okay. So I ask, how are the Democratic leaders of today responsible for the actions of the Democratic leaders that have been dead for ages? Now, I'm not saying that the Democratic Party today doesn't have racism in it. There exists a serious problem of racism in the Democratic Party, but the people who bring up that the Democratic Party used to be the party of slavery and Jim Crow fail to make the connection between that and its racism of today. If the argument is that by choosing to align yourself with a certain political party as a politician, you're taking up the history of said party, I could actually agree with that. And if that means that the people who make up the Democratic Party today have to use their power to take responsibility for that history, I'm all for that. But it's not like the Democrats aren't already trying to do that. They are, in the form of reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. But what do you know? Republicans oppose those reparations. So at this point it's like, what do you want them to do? Something that really annoys me about this line of thinking is that it's making it out like Democrats of today are in some way, shape or form linked to the Democrats of back then. Like they're the same people. Now, I do recognize that since the Democratic Party was literally founded on slavery, all of that doesn't just wash away in a couple centuries. And some of that racism will inevitably follow them into the present day. But you can make the same argument for most political parties that existed during extremely racist times, and thus contributed to a racist system. And it's not like the right doesn't also deny the existence of systemic racism as well. So it's not like they would even make that argument in the first place. But hey, you know what the Democrats also founded? The Confederacy. But conservatives still get triggered whenever the Confederate flag and or statues are taken down. And that's not even mentioning that the Ku Klux Klan, who, yes, used to be Democrats, now overwhelmingly vote Republican, and express support for Donald J. Trump during his run in office. Another thing that Republicans also like to bring up is that Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, was a Republican. Now, setting aside the fact that this still doesn't justify anything that the Republicans are doing now, what these people are neglecting to mention is that Abraham Lincoln had connection to no one other than Karl Marx, and the two wrote letters to each other. And it was him who actually suggested freeing the slaves to Abraham Lincoln.
Address of the International Working Men's Association to Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America. While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. They were unable to attain the true freedom of labor, or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world.
Yet, I don't see any Republicans becoming Marxists because of that. And while the right may deny the racism of the Republican Party, one thing that they will never deny is its conservatism. Despite the fact that the Democrats, that were the party of slavery so many years ago, were likely also pretty conservative. Yet I don't see many of these Republicans saying that the Democrats are the real conservatives, because conservatism doesn't have the same reputation as racism. Because conservatism isn't directly an immoral position like racism is. But what many of these Republicans don't seem to mention is that one of the main reasons that black people were enslaved is because of old conservative religious values like sin. Basically because there was no Christianity in Africa before the European colonizers opposed it on the African people. The Europeans came to the conclusion that the African people were all sinners, and therefore an uncivilized people. Yet I don't see many of these black Republicans, many of whom are themselves Christian by the way, talk about that. Of course, American nationalism, which is also very conservative, was probably at play as well. So it seems that wherever conservatism goes, racism follows. And during the Southern strategy, it went from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Most Republicans would probably admit that the Republicans of today are more conservative than the Democrats. And sometimes I wonder, if the Republicans that fought against slavery were somehow still alive today, what would they think of what the Republicans are doing today? I mean, obviously they would still be very conservative, as everyone was back during that time, but still, maybe the Republicans of back then would be the progressives of today. And a lot of this, the Democrats were the real racist nonsense, is often being brought up in response to Black Lives Matter, as to suggest that if BLM really want to help black people, they would support the people that are telling black people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Which is just such an embarrassing thing to suggest that it makes me question if these people are really acting in good faith. If Black Lives Matter wanted to help black people today, then they're obviously not gonna vote for the party that used to help them, but the one that's helping them right now. And it's not like Black Lives Matter doesn't have criticisms of the Democrats. Black progressive activists have tons of criticisms of the Democrats. And many of them don't even like the Democrats. I think for many black people, they're just a lesser evil.
I mean, we put a black face on a white imperialist nation and expected that change was going to happen. My grandmother, my ancestors, especially my grandmother, my grandfather, they were sold that that was what the American dream was supposed to look like, that a black man could come in this country, that black people could come from chattel slavery and achieve the highest position in the land. Unfortunately, the way that these systems of oppression work, especially K through 12, we're often taught that leadership, what's gonna lead black people to liberation is gonna come from a white man. And, you know, so like when we then had a black face up there, it really felt like, we really close, like we really close. But then it was a lot of unlearning that a lot of us had to do, a lot of unlearning that we all still currently have to do to understand that our oppression, you know, where our oppression came from, and the fact that like we're never going to be led to liberation in a binary system. A binary system for black people is literally always going to be us choosing the lesser of two evils, no matter how you slice it or dice it. Whether it's a Republican in office, whether it's a Democrat in office, I'm always choosing my death either as a blunt force blow or death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it tends why, I guess, in general, black people always lean Democratic is because that death is by 1,000 paper cuts.
And let's say that Black Lives Matter did support the Republicans. Do you think that support would be mutual? No, of course not. Black Lives Matter says we need to do something about police brutality against black people, and Republicans say, just don't commit crime. They say we need better education, and Republicans say, just move. They say we need to do something about poverty in black neighborhoods, and Republicans say, just get a job. You get the picture. It's clear that while the Democrats may not have their best interest in mind, they certainly have their better interest in mind. That being said, I still don't want this video to come off as an endorsement of the Democratic Party. They might be better than the Republicans, but a lot of black people that do vote Democrat have very justified reasons for their animosity towards the Democratic Party. Whether it be their incredible held-back attempt at solving systemic racism, or properly addressing and making up for its racist past, or its support for policies that do hurt the black community, it's safe to say that the Democratic Party is not exactly the party for black people. And I get why a lot of black people don't want to support a party that clearly does not have their best interest in mind. But what's the solution? Well, it's not to vote third party, since that is literally made impossible. If there's something that has become abundantly clear over the talk of who are the real racists, the Democrats or the Republicans, it's that the solution is to abolish the two-party system. Now I want to move away from the Democratic Party and address some of the arguments about progressives head-on. Number 1. Disagreeing with black people is racist. I wish I was joking, but no, this is a sentiment that a lot of people on the right, or even so-called anti-FJWs, seem to hold. I mean, that's certainly what the logical conclusion of their argument is. An argument that they always and exclusively use against progressives. You've probably heard this before. Oh, you claim to support black people, except for the ones you disagree with. Racist much? Well, yeah, isn't that the point of disagreement? I mean, it of course depends on what you mean by support. If by support you mean agree, then no. This argument is so mind-numbingly backwards that I actually refuse to believe that anyone making it actually believes in what they're saying. It basically can be boiled down to, oh, you claim to agree with people, except for the people you don't agree with. Yes, that's the very simple concept of disagreement. I can't believe I have to explain the very basic concept of disagreement to these people. Because I don't. I actually don't. Because, like I already said, the people who make this argument don't actually believe it. There's no way that an adult could actually believe this presents a coherent argument. No, instead, I think it's just an attempt at a cheap gotcha. But I'll elaborate more on that later. Now, not everyone who makes this argument phrases it the same way. But you could replace the word support with any of these words, and the base of the argument will remain the same. There are a lot of variations of this argument, but they all come down to the same thing. You claim to support black people, except for the ones you disagree with. But if by support you mean support their rights, then yes, of course I support their rights. Even the ones that don't support their own rights. And we can talk about the whole you claim to support black people part, because none of the people this argument gets used against ever explicitly said, I support black people. Now, I'm sure they said things that indicate that they do, but don't most people support the rights of black people? But the way it's being phrased by these people, most of the time makes it out like supporting the rights of black people is something special that only hyper-woke social justice warriors do. And I think that also reveals something about the person making that argument. Because it inadvertently suggests that they don't support the rights of black people, or that to support the rights of black people you need to agree with every single black person. Which is impossible, since a lot of black people, just like anyone else, have opinions that are the exact opposite of other black people. So I reject this idea that to support people of color you need to agree with all of them. In fact, it kinda sounds like something that the SJWs that these people always talk about would do. So that's why I'm so disappointed to see that no one in the anti-SJW community ever calls this behavior out. Because it seems like the thing that they have been fighting against all this time. But they seem to be just fine with it when people from their own side do it. It's hypocritical, and no amount of unfunny, poorly drawn caricatures is going to change that. And like I said, no one who says this actually believes this. It's a way to troll. Irony poisoning, if you will. And that's actually a really big part of this. Irony. A lot of these people that are making the it's the anti-racists that are the real racist arguments are making them ironically. It's like an inside joke in the anti-SJW community to parody SJWs. I remember back when I was an anti-SJW, I thought this was hilarious. But now I see it for what it is, muddying the waters of the conversation. It's pretty easy to let bad faith arguments slide if they're on your side, especially if it's an inside joke, since inside jokes make people feel included into an in-group. But wherever there's an in-group, there's an out-group. The in-group being the anti-SJW community, and the out-group being anyone who they perceive as SJWs. And anyone who's in on the joke can feel special, knowing exactly what's going on while snickering at the out-group's confusion. And as someone who used to be part of the in-group, I can expose this bullshit for what it is, and explain why the joke doesn't work. It's very reminiscent of this meme. Like, the people that you're parodying, you are becoming those people. Also, those people that actually embody the straw man that you're trying to portray make up an incredibly small amount of the progressive wing. An amount that you guys often overestimate. And I've seen a lot of political satire from conservatives. And it's always just them doing impressions of SJWs. And the problem is, it's just not funny. Like, after so long, we get it. Angry blue-haired feminist is triggered. But then, why do they keep doing it? Because after so long, you'd think they'd get tired of this joke as well. Well, maybe that's because there's more to this shtick than just irony and memes for them to entertain themselves with. Now, this next part may be a bit theorized, but some of it is also based on things that can be seen in plain sight. A lot of this irony poisoning stems from the anti-SJW community often wanting to have their cake and eat it too, or rather, a desire to give the SJWs a taste of their own medicine. But what is this medicine? See, when I was still an anti-SJW, I always thought that the progressives had an unfair advantage in their way of arguing their points. From my perspective, they could win arguments by accusing people of being racist, sexist, or transphobic, or invoke their own identity as an argument. To me, this was an incredibly effective tactic. The progressives could accuse the anti-SJWs of being racist, and they couldn't do the same thing to them. I mean, they could accuse them of being racist against white people, but let's be honest, that doesn't hold the same weight to it, does it? Much of this stemmed from my perception of how the broader public of people that weren't as politically involved or as terminally online as the anti-SJWs and SJWs were, viewed these arguments. Basically, I feared that the majority, as I imagined them, were going to be swayed by SJW arguments instead of anti-SJW arguments. I thought the progressives' ability to accuse their critics of racism was a trump card, one that had a hypnotizing effect on the majority. Since I was aware of the weight that an accusation of racism carried, with how racism was viewed by the rest of people. So me trying to disprove the accusations of racism, or ignore them, felt like a losing battle. And thus, on this internet culture war, the anti-SJWs were getting more and more fed up with the progressives and grew more animosity towards them. Keep this in mind, as it's important for later on. Now, I do want to say that I partly understand the anti-SJW's frustration with this. Ultimately, being labeled as racist is frustrating. Nobody wants to be called a racist, even genuine racists. But the response to these accusations is where the anti-SJW community loses my sympathy. Basically, with the growing animosity towards the progressive wing from the anti-SJWs, being accused of racism felt like being punched and not being able to do anything back. It wasn't fair that the SJWs could accuse them of racism and they couldn't. So eventually the anti-SJW said enough is enough, and they decided to use the progressives' tactics against them. It was a way to show the SJWs how it feels to be accused of racism, and to see how they would react. So what followed was anti-SJWs searching for opportunities to label the progressives racist. By the way, I just want to add, not all of it was about racism. The same also goes for sexism, homophobia, and sometimes even transphobia. I'm just using racism for the sake of example, and because it was seen as the main form of bigotry by the anti-SJWs. So whenever the anti-SJWs were dealing with people who had a reputation of accusing other people of racism, in a way that the anti-SJWs found too liberally, instead of condemning this, the anti-SJWs decided to copy it. And a lot of times they even chose both. This a lot of times manifested itself in arguments such as, "Oh, you call yourself a feminist, and yet you don't support women that are anti-feminists." And a lot of other arguments that are very similar to the ones that I was previously talking about when it came to the whole disagreeing with black people as racist thing. Honestly, a lot of these arguments could be summed up as, if you criticize someone from insert identity group, you're against insert identity group. Which is very interesting, because a lot of times this quote-unquote criticism was levied against woke white people. So, considering a lot of these anti-SJW YouTubers made videos about anti-white SJWs, someone could easily throw that criticism back at them. Like, "Oh, you claim to be against racism against white people, except for the ones you disagree with. Looks like anti-SJWs are the real reverse racists." Or maybe they were already going off of the assumption that no one would actually call them out on that obvious inconsistency. And I gotta say, it worked. Because for the longest time, I didn't see anyone call them out on it. Until now. Because now I'm calling them out on it. So, let's start with the reasons they may have had for doing this. Because I know we already established it was to give the so-called SJWs a taste of their own medicine. But I think it goes even deeper than that. A lot of it was probably also because they were hoping for a certain response. They probably wanted to see woke white people try to defend themselves against accusations of racism. Like I said, they want to flip the script. Because, I will admit, a lot of the woke white people that the anti-SJWs made videos on really did seem to genuinely feel guilty about being white. But I gotta say, a lot of these white social justice warriors really did sound like they hated themselves. And a lot of the things they said, I do think were worthy of criticism. But not this type of criticism. Honest criticism. That doesn't involve stuff like, if you criticize someone from insert identity group, you're against the insert identity group. But it was probably too tempting to accuse them of racism back. But that doesn't change the fact that it's still hypocrisy. Pure it's okay when we do it bullshit. And it does show that the anti-SJWs are willing to throw away everything they stand for just to own the SJWs. Even if that means becoming them. Like, did you really think that no one would notice that this goes directly against some of the things you have been saying for ages? Arguments like accusing everyone of racism makes racism lose its definition. Criticizing a minority isn't racist. You know, these arguments that you used to make, and technically still make against the people who you guys label SJWs. And you can't claim you're doing it out of irony, or to give the SJWs a taste of their own medicine. Because that's literally the definition of bad faith.
Just a quick intermission while I'm editing this. I feel like insecurity also had a lot to do with it. Now, what I don't mean with that is insecurity in a very literal individual sense, but more so a concern with image. It's probably no surprise to most people that the image of a racist is not very appealing. At least not the one that most people have in their heads. The image most people have in their heads is of a very angry, hateful, obnoxious, crazy person. So when you're constantly defending yourself from accusations of racism, even if from your perspective those accusations are false, from an outside perspective, you're still gonna have that image associated with you one way or another. So, in the eyes of the public, even if the public isn't on the side of the progressives accusing you of racism, on a subconscious level, in their head, you're still gonna end up looking like the weirdos. Just simply because of how much weight an accusation of racism carries, and all the associations that come with it. So in that case, flipping the script also works in terms of optics. If you accuse the left of racism, suddenly they look like the weirdos. And now you're no longer in a position where you need to defend yourself. But the optics of doing that can only get you so far. What would of course really help is to actually push back on the very real racism on your side. Because otherwise, every accusation you make against the left of being the real racists is going to sound like a massive "no you" retort. Think about it. If you call out racism on your own side, then you basically beat your detractors to it. And then you won't look like the racist weirdos to everyone else, and you will instead look like a person who calls out racism because they're genuinely against it, and not just to defend yourselves. Because let's be honest, most conservatives, if you really press them on it, will be able to admit that there are genuine racists in their community. And I think a lot of that insecurity of not wanting to look like the racist ones also comes from the very real racism that's on the right. Like, they're aware of the racism that's going on their side, and they don't like it. But that's why I think that the best thing to do in that situation is to fight the racism instead of throw it back. I think that will also make for much more productive conversations.
Lately, there has also been a lot of talk about identity politics, and how anti-SJWs often invoke it despite being against it. And since recently, a lot of leftist YouTubers have been calling them out on it. And this tactic is used mainly by anti-SJWs that belong to a marginalized group. Normally, the anti-SJWs that do this don't really respond to this criticism. Or when they do, it's in a really half-assed, dismissive way, so that they don't actually have to address the criticism. And a counter-argument I see a lot in those cases is that they are not the ones invoking identity politics, it's the left who uses identity politics. And that they're just simply calling them out on it. Because the left talks about being anti-racist all the time, yet they criticize black people.
Especially if you are someone that claims to say, I'm an anti-racist, I want to fight racism. Well, guess what? I'm black. So, put your money where your mouth is and actually try to hear me out. Otherwise, I can't help but think you're a hypocrite. And side note, because a common argument that I get from my opposition is that I weaponize identity politics when it's convenient for me. No, boo-boo. I don't know if you just realized what sarcasm meant, but let me explain this to you. I am simply showing you how paper thin your arguments are when you are using it in the context of identity. For example, amplify black voices, unless of course it's a black conservative or a black Republican or a black libertarian. Now all of a sudden, black voices don't really matter. That is the reason I say, as a black woman, it's not because I subscribe to this rhetoric, it's because you subscribe to this rhetoric, and I'm trying to show you that you don't even believe it. Because if you did, your logic would remain consistent, regardless of what political party they fall on or what ideology they believe.
Even though being anti-racist doesn't mean you can't criticize black people, and no leftist ever said it did, and most people on the left don't just outwardly say, I'm anti-racist, let's amplify black voices. Most of the time, there's a pre-existing context surrounding it. Because those statements in isolation can mean just about anything. Most of the time, when people say amplify black voices, they're saying it in relation to systemic racism. Give black people a platform so they can talk about their experiences with racism. They're not just saying amplify black voices so they can talk about absolutely anything, even if it's completely unrelated to the topic of racism. And even then, you can amplify black voices and we can criticize them. This is why arguments like, you claim to want to amplify black voices, but not the ones you disagree with, don't work. Because, let's be honest, if we propped up the voices of black people that talk about how systemic racism isn't real, and black people just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that would completely contradict the reason why we want to amplify black voices in the first place, because they are victims of systemic racism. And if we just ignored that, then you guys would be calling us out on that too. Saying stuff like, wow, the left claims to be anti-racist and to want to fight systemic racism, yet they amplify the voices of people that say they are against anti-racism or that systemic racism isn't real just because those people are black. Looks like the left has become so obsessed with looking woke that they're hurting their own cause. And don't pretend like you wouldn't be saying that, because you would. And a lot of this perceived hypocrisy, I think, comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what identity politics actually is, and the arguments that leftists actually make. See, when leftists talk about the importance of perspectives of marginalized groups, they're not saying that therefore the perspectives of those who are not marginalized are completely invalid. They're simply saying that when a person who isn't marginalized talks about how people that are, let's say, too sensitive, or aren't actually as marginalized as they claim to be, that the fact that they themselves aren't part of those groups, and so don't have the same experience that they do, that may cloud their judgment. And that should be taken into account. But it shouldn't be used to dismiss all their arguments altogether. That is not identity politics. But because anti-SJWs seem to not understand that at all, they end up not actually parodying an argument they disagree with, but a straw man of an argument they disagree with, or a very extreme version of an argument that they disagree with, that only a microscopical, irrelevant percentage of leftists actually make. This is why arguments of perceived hypocrisy don't work when arguing with the points of an individual person. Because if your argument is that they don't practice what they preach, well, what if they don't preach the thing that you're claiming they preach at all, and they actually preach against it? At that point, you are the one invoking identity politics. It would be like if I said to these black conservatives, oh, you hate black people, yet you yourself are black. Hypocrite much? All they would need to do is to say, well, I don't hate black people, and my argument would be destroyed. Now, all of this isn't to say you can't ever accuse a leftist or a progressive of racism. There's plenty of racism on the left. But my point is that you should be doing it because you genuinely think that that person was being racist, and not because you want to get back at the left, or because you think it's funny. And I know there will be those people that will say that the anti-SJWs do genuinely believe that the people they accuse of racism are racist. I'd call bullshit, because we can tell when you're lying. Because if your argument is in any way similar to this, or if what you're saying directly contradicts what your entire channel stands for, it's safe to say you're not being very genuine.